Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Wednesday, January the 12th, 2022. You might remember some time ago, I was discussing an essay by Michael Anton at the American Mind called That's Not Happening and It's Good That It Is. Gaslighting getting you down, feel like the regime has dialed the megaphone up to and past 11. You're not crazy. It's definitely happening and likely to get worse. As our master's ability to cope with reality further worsens or worse, they gain the complete and absolute control they seek. They're both scornful and terrified of dissent, which explains why they incessantly shriek at us and lie to our faces. Which leads me to an essay by Henry Delacroix at the American Sun called Resetting the Corporate World. The Great Reset progressed from conspiracy theory to desired policy quickly. There are bumps in the road, like the pause in passing Biden's Build Back Better. COVID is a process and a tool, regardless of the passage of BBB. The entire private sector is undergoing a reset. What should emerge is a much more progressive corporate bureaucracy. COVID has switched from being just a disease that may kill off portions of a firm's workforce to a useful political weapon. A political weapon. Citigroup announced they will fire unvaccinated employees by the end of January. We now know the vaccines do not stop transmission. The Supreme Court rules on vaccine mandates soon. Citi itself likely has a significant slice of employees working remote. What purpose does it serve but to fire a politically unreliable employee? Vaccination status became a part of partisan identity. Polls are a bit unreliable, but per Brookings, 40% of Republicans did not plan on getting vaccinated versus just 3% of Democrats this fall. If someone is unvaccinated, they might be right-wing or they just might be skeptical of approved narratives. The vaccinated listen to science and perform the progressive rituals. These are politically reliable employees to staff bureaucracies. A potentially revealing fact might be white-collar firms that do not allow remote work above a certain management tier, and if those tiers must be vaccinated due to being in an office over 50% of the time. They can close doors for unvaccinated employees. Suddenly, there is an implicit political loyalty test to apply for employees, allowing the left to reward only its adherents. This is one vector of attack, as nothing lives in a vacuum. As Chris Rufo has exposed, giant firms are deploying critical race theory training for employees with some special sessions for executives. This is another political tool to make sure that employees are good soldiers or are willing to bend the knee to play along. This is the second political loyalty program. Firms will either staff their bureaucracies with loyal progressive employees or employees willing to execute on progressive goals. This takes time, but pushing this at the executive levels makes sense as a trickle-down effect will happen. Someone's firm targets X percent. Each division needs to aggregate to that target. What do you think hiring, firing, and promotion decisions will be when that target is tied to compensation? Everyone has metrics to check, and progressives and their clients win again. Someone might argue that this is self-sabotage, but the other COVID factor playing into the reset is this great shuttering of small and even medium businesses. Not everyone is a monopoly like Google, but many industries are cartels where a handful of major firms dominate and everyone else squabbles in niche markets and the remaining 20% of the market. Not many articles on struggling airlines because the sector spent the Obama years consolidating into a cartel. The other factor in this is that big firms often only engage with other big firms who can handle their size of business. Small firms never get a chance at those business-to-business contracts, and mid-sized firms may not have the capacity or would see their client pool dominated by one such mega-sized contract. It is often lamented, Henry Delacroix continues, that Main Street has been wrecked by lockdowns with countless reports of the raising of small firms under 250 employees. The destruction of smaller firms that often relied on customization and customer experience for their market share plays into big firms being the only game in town. Smaller firms will likely see worse service and options as those small, flexible firms that provided goods and services disappear. We may see mid-sized firms without pricing power fold as the supply chain crisis continues. We haven't even touched on BlackRock's control of investment and its highly progressive CEO. Sorry, midcap, you won't be getting billions for expansion until you kiss the progressive ring. Now the big firms dominate their markets. The economic gains will be shared with shareholders and the professional class that executes on the captured market. They can house clean out the politically unreliable in multiple ways. Private political commissars may be a drag on profits, maybe, but it does not matter when there's no threat to the firm's survival. The same team can split the spoils. We won't build back better, but these firms will emerge more progressive. Again, that's from Henry Delacroix at theamericansun.com. And of course, this reminds me that so-called conservatives on the subject of business have got the wrong end of the stick. Small is beautiful. No, but the conservatives want more and more and more scale. Bigger and bigger and bigger is better. So we end up with a situation where a handful of firms, or BlackRock, can simply say to everyone else, you will do this or else. Oh, and by the way, our governments decided that your business is non-essential. So, just wait for your government welfare check and you don't have a business anymore. But, in the future, no one will own anything. No one will have any privacy, and we will love it. Now, the 1% will own more and more and more, and they'll have all the privacy that they want. But for the rest of us, I guess we should have been born with richer parents. Now, a key part of building back better is the electric vehicle. All the politicians love electric vehicles. Pete Buttigieg was filming a promo for one he released a promo for one last week. And again, especially if you watch this with the sound off, he really doesn't appear human. Well, he does actually appear, as a correspondent said, as a human sociopath. But here's an article from Eric Peters Autos by, I guess, Eric Peters, called The Lessons of I-95. A few days ago, Virginia, home to this writer, was hammered by a sudden onslaught blizzard that dumped almost a foot of snow along the I-95 corridor, the name we Virginians use to reference the stretch of Interstate 95 that runs from Richmond up to Northern Virginia near D.C. before it threads up the East Coast to New York and beyond. The snow was so fierce and heavy it paralyzed traffic on I-95, which became a kind of extended parking lot for much of the distance between Richmond and Northern Virginia, which is more than 100 miles. Thousands of drivers were stuck inside their cars for as long as 27 hours, which is more than one full day if you're counting. This is extremely inconvenient as well as uncomfortable, assuming your car isn't an RV with beds in the back and cable TV. It could be something else if your car happens to be electric. EVs don't like sudden unplanned things because they're more likely to be not ready for them, since it takes them hours to charge if not plugged into a fast charger, and none of these are at home. You have to drive to where they are. This is hard to do if you can't drive to where they are. Backup electricity for EVs is also harder to store and much less portable. If the power goes out because of a snowstorm and you have a 5-gallon jug of gas in the garage or shed, you can drive your car, your not electric car, about 100 miles easily, even if it's a gas guzzler. Easy to find more gas along the way. If the power goes off on your Energy Hog EV, a Tesla carries around 1,000 pounds of battery pack necessary to deliver the touted ludicrous speed, is empty, it will be harder to find a can of kilowatts or go anywhere. People who own electric vehicles found out about these limitations during one of the regularly occurring hurricanes that hit Louisiana and the Gulf area a few years back. Many didn't have the luxury of time to charge in time to get away from the hurricane, but at least they didn't freeze. Keep in mind that EVs generate heat by burning electricity. It takes a lot of electricity to power an electric heater. Ask any homeowner who has a heat pump or baseboard electric heating, the latter being the type of heater most EVs have. How much range on that? Enough to stay warm and alive for 27 hours? Maybe not. especially not if you got stuck without a full charge, which you forgot to plan for because you didn't think you'd be stuck in a blizzard, and now you are. So, what's now? Jumping jacks? There's no way to recharge on the fly in the midst of a snowstorm in the middle of a parking lot full of snowed in cars on I 95. Most lower tier EVs like the Nissan Leaf, Chevy Bolt, and Volkswagen ID4 have a best case range of about 150 to 250 miles or so. Much of that would be depleted by the time you got halfway to Richmond from DC, depending on how you were driving. Also, upon how much you've been using electrically powered accessories such as the heater and the defroster. These only work by burning electricity, which necessarily means that less is available to propel the car, and the reverse. The EV's battery pack must also be kept warm, by the way. There's electric heating for that too. So, whatever the advertised best case range is, it will be less than advertised if you use electrically powered accessories, which means all accessories in an electric car, including the heater for the battery pack, which must be kept at a certain temperature, else it cannot be charged. Many people are unaware of that for the same reason a shady used car salesman won't tell a mark about the chassis rust he covered up with black paint. Electric batteries also lose charge faster when it's very cold, doubling down on this problem. Imagine finding yourself stuck in a blizzard, perhaps without the heavy clothes appropriate to survival in a blizzard, watching the charge indicator wilt as the car tries to keep you warm. Of course, you'd be just as stuck in a not electric car, but less likely to freeze, because you could have filled up to full at the nearest gas station spur of the moment after having heard the radio reports about the suddenly here storm. You might even have put a 5-gallon jug of extra gas in the trunk for just in case. You would not be stuck for hours tethered to a cord. The gas powered car is also better suited for such frigid emergencies for another reason. A combustion engine's car's heat is a byproduct of combustion. It takes burning gas to generate that heat, of course, but it does not cost as much energy as it does in an electric car, because idling the engine in a gas engined car doesn't burn much gas, but it does create plenty of heat. Driving an electric car in winter is kind of like taking a vaccine that doesn't immunize. There are better, safer alternatives in both cases and without the costs. People got a look-see at those costs a few days ago. They might also have a look at the power rationing occurring in states like California, which is generally not cold, but where you'll be stuck if there's no electricity available to charge up your EV. And again, this is an essay from Eric Peters at ericpetersauto.com. Let's have a look at the chat. Palcaso88, hello, says sometimes I tune out when Kevin starts talking about COVID. Nothing against KMG. He's awesome, but it's just so effing infuriating. Yes, I understand, but I don't know. I suppose during the Blitz in London, and of course, COVID-19, it's, the Omicron variant is just like the Blitz, right? I suppose people got bored of that. But I think there was no escape. Hello to Quachulango, Anran Gamion. Chogokin 666 says, sutures out, feels good. Glad to hear it. Hello to Emmett Kelly's Earth. William Hicks, Dawn from Beyond. Jeff Godley, Tom Anderson, Zen Master Football Analysis. Half Galicians, blessings to you too. Moral Outrage Prophet quotes J.J. Cale, the man in charge has got to go. Free markets and small government, says Chogokin 666. Well, the days of small government are over. They're not coming back unless there's an economic collapse, which seems increasingly possible. I mean, it turns out that people have become dependent on the government. Certainly so in my country of Canada. But, when I watch those Medicare commercials on MeTV, golly, there's so many of them that gives you an idea of how many people in the United States, and these are just old people over 65, who are utterly dependent on the government. Anwar says, Kevin, do you ever get burned out doing this show and talking about the same woke deep state crap day after day? Burned out? No, I don't think so. But he says, how much do you appreciate Handel's Messiah? Well, everyone loves Handel's Messiah, right? As do I. I just bought a new car for the fam, anticipating even greater gas shortage this year, says a buddy. A family member has a Tesla. I've driven it. It's stupid fast, says buddy. I predict car explosions, says Moral Outrage Prophet. Old Major, hello. A new name to me. EVs are just another scam. Pelcasso 88 says Ottawa's chief doctor said everyone will get Omicron, then said everyone needs to get boosted. Unbelievable. Yes, that it's not happening, but it's good that it is, right? Did you see the Israeli expert's open letter to the health ministry, says Metal Mike? I will talk about that shortly. Don from Beyond says, I want to keep hearing Kevin talk about COVID because to me, it's by far the most important thing going on in the world. Gamian says, I was away from the news for 2 weeks. Highly recommended doing that for your own sake. I'm calmer and my mind slower. Feeling it revving up again, though. Culture Talk is my favorite KMG mode, says Hauper. Well, you're going to have to wait a little while. Of course, depends on what you mean by culture. Mary Harrington has a piece in Unheard called Vaccine Purity Has Infected the West. Mocking anti-vaxxers' deaths is ghoulish yet, but may be necessary, declared Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Michael Hiltzik earlier this week. Those who have deliberately flouted sober medical advice by refusing vaccination should, in Hiltzik's view, be viewed as receiving their just desserts if then they die after contracting COVID-19. COVID-19 doesn't discriminate, or at least does so on the basis of age and health conditions rather than politics. Why then have views on how we should manage it, and particularly how we should treat vaccination, become so heartless, judgmental, and politically tribal? We have a milder case of it in Britain than some countries, but there's a correlation between broadly Remain-affiliated liberal urbanites and the new hygiene authoritarianism. This has been emerging for a while. Back in 2020, the research group UK in a Changing Europe noted that while it's not the case that all leavers are lockdown skeptics, nevertheless, it's pretty much the case that all lockdown skeptics are leavers. More recently, 99 Tories voted against COVID passes before Christmas compared to 22 in Labour. In the US, analogous and angrier patterns emerge. Freewheeling, mask-optional Republican Florida is pitted against Democrat California, which mandates indoor mask wearing, including for all children over the age of 2, and announced in October that vaccination would become mandatory for in-person school attendance. Vaccination is already mandatory for employment in the police force and healthcare on public health grounds. More interesting than arguing for either side or the other, though, is what the arguments reveal about our ongoing political realignment. In particular, it sounds the death knell for a relatively mild-mannered 20th century version of progressivism characterized by a desire to ensure the world is fair and to avoid harming others. What's emerging to replace it is more bellicose, more ruthless, and increasingly religious. So-called secular liberalism has, in other words, stopped pretending to be secular. It's been received opinion since the end of World War II that authoritarian religiosity was exclusive to the right. Theodor Adorno's 1950 The Authoritarian Personality cited batteries of research to argue that fascism and the Holocaust could be explained by the prevalence of an authoritarian personality type. This personality type, he argued, was characterized by blind allegiance to conventional beliefs about right and wrong, respect for submission to acknowledged authority, and a tendency to project one's own feelings of inadequacy, rage, and fear onto a scapegoated group. Now, perhaps Theodor Adorno had never heard of the Soviet Union or of Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, and forced collectivization and the purges. But everything that he says about fascism and the Holocaust could be said about Soviet Russia. But I guess communists are good people, or they're hopeful people, or they want the best for people. So we'll just ignore what they do. Harrington continues, in turn, Adorno's conviction that these behaviors are characteristic of the right crops up again in a far more recent but also influential book, Jonathan Haidt's 2012 The Righteous Mind. Here, Haidt argued that the reason liberals and conservatives routinely misunderstand one another is that there exist 5 moral foundations on which we all base our political views: care, harm; fairness, cheating; loyalty, betrayal; authority subversion, and sanctity degradation. Haidt argues that liberals are only interested in care harm and fairness cheating, while the right is attuned to all five foundations. Does this apply in the COVID debate? Certainly, at the surface, calls for coercive measures tend to start off with arguments about protecting people. For example, Scottish Public Health Advisor Jason Leach told BBC Good Morning Scotland that the aim of COVID passes was to allow people to attend events and environments safely. At the core of this argument is the not unreasonable point that when it comes to physical well-being, we can't be wholly individualistic. The moment you get ill or injure yourself as a consequence of having taken some risk, for example, after breaking your leg skiing, you need care and are thus, by definition, no longer taking sole responsibility for your well-being. Does this mean vax authoritarians have a point? Hiltzik points out that mandates have long existed on other health grounds where risk-taking imposes costs on wider society, such as seatbelt wearing, smoking, or drink driving. Insisting on the individual right to choose whether or not to be vaccinated, therefore, places a perverse conception of individual freedom in opposition to the communal interest, scare quotes in the original. I should just point out that the infamous EPA study on the effects of secondhand smoking came up with a risk factor of 1.19, which is statistical static. This after the authors of the report of this meta-analysis cherry-picked the studies that they were going to be using and also lowered the confidence level from 95% to 90%. This EPA report is largely the basis on which smoking is banned everywhere indoors now, including on outdoor patios, which of course are not indoors. In 1997, the World Health Organization issued a report saying that there was no risk. There was no appreciable risk from secondhand smoke. The Telegraph reported it. Everyone else decided that no, this is not interesting at all. It's as if it never happened. Back to Harrington. We might simply shrug and say this is just another data point for the 2021 study, which showed that contra Adorno, there is abundant evidence for authoritarianism among left liberals. Certainly, calls from self-identified progressive to crush the resistance to vaccines by making the lives of the vaccinated a total misery might challenge the idea that the authoritarian personality can only flourish on the right. But it's the character and chosen terrain of the emerging progressive authoritarianism that's distinctive, for it's not merely a matter of progressives waking up to the possibility that they too may use coercive measures to pursue their chosen ends. It's also the nature of those ends. Consider, for example, the fact that in 2020, fentanyl killed more Californians than COVID. But unlike COVID, the drug epidemic inspired few coercive measures, only safe injection sites, billboards accusing users or encouraging users to take drugs with friends, or programs that pay them not to use. If avoiding harm justified coercive interventions, surely we'd have seen more of them in Californian drug policy. But their absence in the case of drug abuse and fervent application in the case of virus control suggests that there's a different motive at work than the prevention of harm. Well, yes, I would say that that motive is what Michael Polanyi, the Hungarian philosopher, called moral inversion. Just look at what the situation used to be. For instance, drugs bad, smoking okay, and then reverse that. Or to make it more specific, now we have a situation, smoking marijuana good, smoking tobacco one of the worst of all evils. How did we get here? As I say, moral inversion. In an Evening Standard piece last week, former editor Emily Sheffield argued that our capital city's unvaccinated residents should pay with their freedoms, not ours. And on social media, we saw the same punitive ferocity recently when one American mother reported that when her son tested positive, she didn't just quarantine him, but also took the Xbox, a measure more consistent with chastisement than infection control. The only reason she didn't also confiscate the phone, she says, is so he can text for food and water. Recently, we've had news that Omicron appears to be more infectious but milder, and research that indicates vaccination does very little to prevent transmission of the virus. So rationally, none of these vengeful attitudes make much sense. What's going on? The recent furor over the entry into Australia of unvaccinated tennis superstar Novak Djokovic offers a clue. One Melbourne journalist tweeted how, since he was allowed into the country, fans won't want to come to the tennis matches. Objectively, one single unvaccinated tennis player would make a negligible difference to someone's risk of catching COVID. The only possible reason someone might skip the Australian Open because of Djokovic's presence is if the fear was of a subtler, more metaphysical contagion. In the Bay of Kells in Ireland's County Kerry, there's a small secret graveyard that until recently was overgrown with brambles and largely forgotten. It was a place where grieving parents buried babies who died before they could be baptized, for the unbaptized were spiritually unclean and therefore not permitted burial on a churchyard's consecrated ground. In Eugenics and Other Evils, from 1922, G.K. Chesterton observed that, quote, "It seems quite natural to our politicians to enforce vaccination, and it would seem to them madness to enforce baptism," unquote. Today, the prescience of Chesterton's remark is clear, as is the convergence in terms of social meaning between vaccination and baptism. The growing tendency for the vaccinated to treat the unvaccinated as other or impure recalls the willingness of an earlier age to deny other simple forms of inclusion on the basis of baptism. Never mind what studies say about the efficacy of COVID vaccination in protecting us from severe illness, which evidence strongly suggests it does, or mitigating further infection, perhaps more debatable. Increasingly, vaccination carries a social meaning as well as a medical one. It's a ritual infusion, albeit via injection, not anointment, of sacred liquid whose application confers freedom from spiritual taint. And speaking of demonization, I would have said not that long ago that the existence of a piece such as this one by James Macaulay in the Washington Post would have been, well, unthinkable. But here we go. Macron is right. It's time to make life a living hell for anti-vaxxers. And again, that's an exact quotation. He begins, French President Emmanuel Macron certainly has a way with words. His statements can often be cutting, withering, and sometimes even offensive. But sometimes the ex-investment banker has a point. Sometimes he speaks the truth. In an interview with France's Le Parisien newspaper, Macron shared his thoughts about France's unvaccinated population. He did not mince his words. The unvaccinated, I really want to piss them off, he said. And so we're going to continue doing so until the end. That's the strategy. The English translation hardly does the comment justice. In French, the verb he used is emmerder, which means quite literally to cover in excrement. The ire is difficult to translate, but in French it is crystal clear enough to have launched an entire polemic after the interview published last Tuesday. And then he reports a negative reaction to what Macron had to say. Here's the other thing. Despite the hand-wringing over an apparently unpresidential choice of words, the comment already seems to have worked. By last Thursday, the first full day after Macron's comment was made, France's health ministry announced that the number of first vaccinations against the coronavirus had tripled to 66,000, the country's highest figure since October the 1st. In the beginning, Europe's vaccine campaign last spring, and France's in particular, left much to be desired. I myself wasted no time in criticizing it, but in the long haul, there's no way to ignore the steady progression of the French campaign. The secret of the French campaign's success is that Macron's strategy has long been to emmerder those who refuse vaccines, instituting QR codes to get into restaurants, cafes, movie theaters, and other public places, though you could still get a valid health pass with a negative test or a recovery certificate. Funny how even the loudest vaccine skeptics start to reconsider their convictions when they realize they won't be able to drink wine on cafe terraces. It's almost as though their convictions are not so much convictions and actually just, well, what Macron said. This is vile, quite simply vile. So what is the left telling us? If we don't like you, we will destroy you. If you disagree with us, we will destroy you. Well, people like James Macaulay should keep in mind, I know it's unthinkable for them now, that a lot of us are going to remember who said what and when. And in terms of making life a living hell, well, two can play that game. Oh, what does Howard Stern think about all this? Can anyone guess? I certainly could. This is Warner Todd Houston at Breitbart. Vax zealot Howard Stern is branching off from his constant attacks on NFL QB Aaron Rodgers to demanding that tennis star Novak Djokovic be banned for life over the player's vaccine status. With the vax controversy swirling around him, the former terrestrial shock jock tore into the tennis star Tuesday, saying that F not Djokovic, what an effing asshole. The first I've heard of this guy is that he doesn't want to get his vaccine. They should throw him right the F out of tennis. That's it. Goodbye. The self appointed king of all media. Has anyone noticed that the older he becomes, the more obnoxious Howard Stern is? Well, he's always been obnoxious, but I mean obnoxious in a rather different way. You know, my way or the highway. Does Howard Stern believe that he has the plenary power to ban people from professional tennis? This is from Twitchy. Former President Donald Trump said in an interview last night on OAN that politicians who won't admit publicly that they got the booster or not are, quote, gutless. And he took credit for the vaccines, which have, quote, saved tens of millions of people throughout the world. Trump says, I've had the booster, but says he's seen politicians ask the same, but dodge. The answer is yes, but they don't want to say it because they're gutless, whether you had it or not. Say it. And then he repeated his claim. Is this a dig at DeSantis, says Rahim Kassam? I think it clearly is. But what Trump is done here is that he owns the vaccine now. He is the vaccine president. Now, this is not going to sit very well with his supporters. The closer we get to the 2024 election, the worse this stand is going to seem. I think this is a very serious error by Trump. This is from Steve Watson at Summit News. Oh, we all love the kiddies, right? Oh, you got to vax the kiddies because we all love the kiddies. I don't believe them. I think they hate children. Fairfax County Parents Association has posted video taken from this week showing school children being seated on the ground outside in the snow in what school officials have described as a mask and snack break. The footage shows a teacher from Waynewood Elementary School, close to Alexandria, reading to the kids while they sit apart on the concrete. The group noted that the temperature was 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Fairfax County Public Schools issued a statement in response, noting this morning on Twitter, an anonymous parent group posted a video that was taken outside of Waynewood Elementary School in Alexandria. In the video, a group of third grade students are taking a snack and mask break in front of the schools. The weather conditions were monitored, and the students were outside for less than 7 minutes. The teacher was reading a story to keep the students entertained. Students do go outside for mask and snack breaks in cold weather, but that time is limited. Once again, I think that they hate children. I think that a lot of teachers certainly hate them. And when we get into school administration and district school boards, district administration, I think they hate children with a passion. Rory Cooper responded to the Fairfax schools. Did the person who wrote this tweet take your mask and snack break outside today? Yeah. We know the facts about COVID-19 and children, but everyone must be vaxxed. As I have joked in the past, and perhaps this will not be a joke, perhaps soon we will be mandating the vaccination of children in utero. This is from Ace of Spades. That's ace.mu.nu. Emails. Fauci was warned that COVID was likely engineered at Wuhan lab, but covered it up. And he comments, I don't see how he avoids prison. National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease head Dr. Anthony Fauci and several other top scientists were warned that COVID-19 could have been created by gain-of-function research in early 2020, according to email transcriptions released Tuesday by Republicans on the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Two scientists, Michael Farzan of the Scripps Research Institute and Robert Gary of Tulane University, noted properties of the virus that they believe pointed to enhanced transmissibility stemming from gain-of-function research. The opinions of both men were provided to Fauci, then National Institutes of Health head Francis Collins, and then NIH Principal Deputy Director Lawrence Tabak in an email from researcher Jeremy Farrar sent January 31st, 2020. The existence of the emails was first revealed by BuzzFeed News in June 2021, but they were released with significant redactions. Due to classification rules, the emails could only be viewed by the Republican committee members and staff, who could then take notes and transcriptions in a classified setting. Farzan was bothered by SARS-CoV furin cleavage site, which he viewed as highly unlikely to have created in an event outside the lab, according to the transcriptions. The existence of a furin cleavage site, which enables the virus to become more transmissible, has been pointed to by several proponents of the lab leak theory. Farzan claimed that a likely scenario for the creation of the furin cleavage site was the passage of SARS live CoVs in tissue culture on human cell lines for an extended period of time. In other words, gain-of-function research on humanized mice. Ace of Spades comments. Although the scientists were warned of the likelihood that COVID was engineered in a lab, they went on to write a paper, likely at Collins and Fauci's insistence, that completely suppressed any mention of a laboratory creation as a possible origin for the virus. Project Veritas also released some documents from the military think tank DARPA indicating that Wuhan was engaging in gain-of-function research. In other words, the research being done is gain-of-function, but EcoHealth, which this was farmed out, NIAID money was farmed out to EcoHealth, which then sent it to China. So, plausible deniability. But EcoHealth is not being frank about that. It is not being open about the potential risks of the research, like releasing a plague upon the world as, for instance. How, again, this is astonishing. I mean, genuinely astonishing. Let's take diseases and make them worse and more easily transmissible because, what? Again, this needs to be banned. It needs to be banned in every country. And those people who insist, there was a moratorium on it in the United States, but Fauci, he's above any kind of, presidential moratorium, apparently. And the people who violate this law against gain-of-function research should be imprisoned for many, many years. What's the worst that can happen? The whole basis that, the world economy is being turned upside down, is going to be destroyed by this climate change hypothesis because the precautionary principle. Well, how about if we apply the precautionary principle to gain-of-function research? At Breitbart, Wendell Huspo, Dr. Anthony Fauci proclaimed Tuesday that coronavirus will infect just about everybody, despite President Biden's promise in July that vaccines would prevent infection. Just about everybody, regardless of vaccination status, will become infected with coronavirus, Fauci told the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Fauci's comments come as Biden promised during the summer that, quote, "you're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations," unquote. As coronavirus hospitalization reached an all-time high Tuesday, it's not the first time Biden made a promise he could not keep. On August 3rd, 2021, he said the U.S. could, quote, "control this virus." On August 6, 2021, Biden said the U.S. could, quote, "beat the Delta variant just as we beat the original COVID-19, unquote. We can do this. On September 24th, Biden said, "Good morning, everyone. As I've said before, we have the tools to beat COVID-19, if we come together as a country and use the tools that we have." Yes, and it was Donald Trump's fault. Every single death attributed to COVID-19 was the personal fault of Donald J. Trump. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. One of Israel's leading immunologists has written a damning letter in which he slams the global management of the COVID-19 pandemic as a shameful disaster driven by, quote, false propaganda. Professor Ehud Kimron is head of the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at Tel Aviv University. His letter speaks for itself and would lose potency if not quoted at length. Quote, 2 years late, you finally realize that a respiratory virus cannot be defeated and that any such attempt is doomed to fail. You do not admit it because you have admitted almost no mistake in the last 2 years, but in retrospect, it is clear that you have failed miserably in almost all of your actions, and even the media is already having a hard time covering your shame. You refuse to admit that the infection comes in waves that fade by themselves, despite years of observations and scientific knowledge. You insisted on attributing every decline of a wave solely to your actions, and so through false propaganda, you overcame the plague. And again, you defeated it, and again, and again, and again. You refuse to admit that mass testing is ineffective despite your own contingency plans explicitly stating so. You refuse to admit that recovery is more protective than a vaccine despite previous knowledge and observations showing that non-recovered vaccinated people are more likely to be infected than recovered people. You refuse to admit that the vaccinated are contagious despite the observations. Based on this, you hoped to achieve herd immunity by vaccination, and you failed in that as well. You slandered colleagues who did not surrender to you. You turned the people against each other, divided society, and polarized the discourse. You branded, without any scientific basis, people who chose not to get vaccinated as enemies of the public and as spreaders of disease. You promote, in an unprecedented way, a draconian policy of discrimination, denial of rights, and selection of people, including children, for their medical choice, a selection that lacks any epidemiological justification. When you compare the destructive policies you are pursuing with the same policies of some other countries, you can clearly see that the destruction you have caused has only added victims beyond those vulnerable to the virus. The economy you ruined, the unemployment you caused, and the children whose education you destroyed are the surplus victims as a result of your own actions only. And again, you can find this excerpt and a link to the full letter at summit.news. And there is a, yes. Again, one would think that this story would get more attention than it has, but no. Again, I'll just counsel you that you might want to use this argument. Why do we all have to get vaxxed? To eliminate the control group. It's really that simple. The story from Israel National News. History will judge the hysteria. Top Tel Aviv, a UProf says there is great interest from anyone who supported the draconian measures in saying Sweden's policy has failed. Because of it succeeded and trillions went down the drain for no reason, someone will have to answer for it. Professor Kimron said. That is why all over the world they prefer to claim that Sweden was wrong, but in the end, the truth came to the surface. In a world where decision makers, their advisors, and the media were able to admit their mistake and the initial panic that gripped them, we would have long since returned to routine. The ongoing destruction due to the inability to admit this mistake, despite the epidemic's small mortality numbers, is outrageous. History will judge the hysteria. If we had not been told that there was an epidemic in the country, you would not have known there was such an epidemic, and you have not done anything about it. The fact that this issue runs all day in the media inflates it beyond its natural dimensions. If Black Death had raged here, as in the 14th century, you would not have had to follow the situation in the news. The bodies would have piled up in the streets. We were not, and we are not in this situation today. Professor Kimron noted that the total number of coronavirus deaths does not exceed 0.1% of the total population in any country, and that the death rate from coronavirus is less than 0.01% of the total world population, meaning that 99.99% of the world's population so far has survived the epidemic, and the virus is negligibly lethal. Well, what are we seeing here? The argument from authority. we determine what the facts are. We have Reuters and the Associated Press, and they will tell us what the facts are. And the facts are whatever the government says, unless the government is led by, Boris Johnson or Donald Trump. Quite a sad story in The Guardian by Nick Gutha. My wife had long COVID and killed herself. We must help ourselves who are suffering. My wife Heidi took her own life after a 13-month battle with long COVID. This started as a mostly asymptomatic coronavirus infection. Long COVID took her from one of the healthiest, most vibrant, no, this is not edited properly. But anyway, he describes her as one of the most vibrant people I've ever known. And it changed her to one so debilitated that she could not bear another day on the planet. There's no such thing as long COVID. It's clear that this woman was suffering from severe depression. Chronic fatigue syndrome is another, it's another example of severe depression. It is not a disease. When people are depressed, they find that they're tired, overwhelmingly tired all the time, and simple things exhaust them. They also find that the regular aches and pains of life become debilitating. I just see the death of this woman is quite sad, but I just see another racket forming, another medical racket, and Big Pharma is going to be in there in a hurry, in a big way. Provinces' right to explore vaccination incentives, Trudeau says, as Quebec plans anti-vax tax. Thousands sign up for first dose of COVID-19 vaccine as Quebec threatens to tax the unvaxxed. I may have said this yesterday. Quebec was, for the longest time, pretty much from Confederation, a very authoritarian place. Starting from 1962, you had the so-called Quiet Revolution. And by 1970, Quebec was completely secularized. The Catholic Church had played a huge role in regulating Quebec. That was over. Of course, Vatican II had a lot to do with that. But the natural authoritarianism of the Quebecois has returned, only this time it is godless. And let's have the latest numbers from Ontario. Cody Wilson, CP24. They're going back and forth on whether they are going to admit these embarrassing facts. 9,783 new cases of COVID-19 reported. Of the cases confirmed today, 327 involved those who were partially vaccinated. 435 involved people with an unknown vaccination status. 1,347 involved people who are unvaccinated, and 7,673 involved people with at least 2 doses of a COVID-19 vaccine. There has never been a successful vaccine for a coronavirus. Never. But, Trump decided to have warp speed. And do you think that Pfizer, say, is going to invest all this money in a vaccine or any drug and then after its testing, say, this was a dud. We're just going to have to, dump this. How likely do you think that it is that a drug company is going to do that? And of course, the FDA in the United States is not testing these drugs. It's not. The drug companies like Pfizer hand over data to the FDA, and the FDA says, yeah, okay, sure, go ahead. This is literally how it works. And news from Oakland, reported by the Washington Post. Students from the Oakland Unified School District have threatened to strike and not attend in-person classes unless the California district reverts to remote learning or complies with a list of health and testing demands that include KN95 masks for each student, more testing, and expanded outdoor space for lunchtime. You know that KN95 masks are one time, right? Do they know this? You use them once, and then you throw them away and put on another one. So here we have a situation where students decide they don't want to go to school. Can you imagine that? I thought children loved school. Okay, you know, if they don't want to go to school, what's the problem? Seriously, what's the problem? Let's look at Steve Kirsch's Substack, New Revelations in the U.S. and what's happening in Israel today. If you want to protect yourself from COVID, it's simple and obvious. Wear a 3M 7502 mask with a P100 filter, done. But they never tell you that, never. Nobody tells you that. Instead, they all tell you to do an intervention, wear a cloth, surgical, or N95 mask, which won't protect you at all and potentially harm you, oxygen deprivation, and risk of respiratory viruses. And then they compound their bad advice on prevention and treatment by mandating that, I'm not going to repeat that. And even if the vaccine was safe, it still causes negative efficacy. This shows you just how inept the authorities and experts are. And we'll go to Eugippius. What convinced you containment was a scam? I mentioned this yesterday, and he got many responses. I was a bit skeptical from the very start, but here's one. But happy to be convinced to play along until three things happened in spring 2020 that made me realize everything was way off and not to be trusted. The first was seeing the paper on Wuhan handling of the epidemic, which made it clear that lockdowns there played no part in controlling the virus. The curve wave followed a natural path and it started to head downwards nicely before the lockdown started. The paper was completely ignored, which set off my alarm bells. The second moment was the hysterical attempts to demonize hydroxychloroquine, especially the fake paper published in The Lancet. It was so badly designed, there was no way it was by accident or ignorance. The third was our government here keeping quiet about close to zero hospital admissions in summer 2020 and actually introducing mandatory masks at that time. Well, you can see, this enforced consent. I mean, masks were not made mandatory. Well, I'm thinking of public transport in British Columbia until September of last year? So the panic is abating, and the governments say, you got to wear a mask. Well, it must be serious. This must be a crisis if we're forced to go around all the time wearing masks. So we essentially become invisible. In our society, I mean, you will recall the controversy about certain, Muslim dress codes. And one of the arguments against it in the West is that in the West, people don't wear masks except if it's, Halloween or perhaps an eyes wide shut party. Wearing a mask is seen as sinister here, but they've made us all do it. Alex Berenson at his Substack writes, more humiliation for Anthony Fauci and vaccine advocates. They promised a booster would work, despite obvious evidence it wouldn't, not years ago, months ago, sometimes weeks ago. Don't let them gaslight you. Don't let them forget. In August, when Israel became the first country to push COVID vaccine boosters, I warned that the evidence for them verged on non-existent and they were unlikely to last more than a few months. This was, to say the least, not the consensus view in the elite media or the public health establishment. Lots of vaccines required boosters, they said. A third dose simply months out simply fixed the rush scheduling of the second dose, they said. And no one pushed this view more aggressively than Dr. Anthony Fauci, who went so far as to promise that the third dose would do what the first two had not and confer long-lasting immunity. And yes, and here's evidence attached from the Washington Post. Yes, these stories are from early September, and America's doctor got his way. Within weeks, regulators had approved boosters, and as the fall went on, they opened the spigots ever wider. Needless to say, the media asked its usual critical questions. Have a barf bag handy as you scroll. Okay, this is persuading me that the effort to forcibly vaccinate people, it's going to get very ugly indeed. I would not be surprised if governments, starting with the Quebec government, actually start arresting people. throwing people into concentration camps. And of course, Dr. Theresa Tam, Canada's chief latrine walla, spoke on video years ago of the possibility of concentration camps in dealing with future pandemics. Yes, actually. Berenson says, I could do this all day, but you get the point. The best part is that this genius level geniusness continued pretty much until last week in the face of massive epidemiological evidence of vaccine collapse when Pfizer itself pulled the plug. Yes, the media lies have gotten so bad that the company had no choice but to tell the truth, which is a victory of sorts, I guess. Again, though, it's not like anyone could have seen this coming. Well, Berenson did. I mean, what do you say about people who tell you, oh, yeah, we've come up with this vaccine. It's perfectly safe and 95% efficacious. And so you get the jab, and then we can all go back to normal. Oh, actually, you're going to need 2 jabs. And we're almost at the point now where you're going to need 3. And now we have talk of yearly vaccination. I mean, how much evidence does anyone need of failed efficacy or even of negative efficacy? How much evidence is required? Let's go to dailyskeptic.org and preschool tyranny. There follows a guest post by a Daily Skeptic reader who wishes to remain anonymous about the borderline child abuse they have witnessed being inflicted on children at their child's nursery. This parent begins, parents with children in nursery care have suffered tremendously with the pandemic. Here is our experience of nurseries in Norfolk. In the first lockdown, we were expected to look after our 2-year-old whilst undertaking 2 full-time jobs at home. This was obviously very hard and meant working evenings and weekends to catch up on day jobs. Initially, our nursery tried to charge full price for not doing anything. They backed down when they realized they could furlough staff. A discount was given. In the January 2021 lockdown, with no notice, they reduced the school day by several hours and removed all meals. We had less than 12 hours notice and no reduction in fees. We know from staff at the nursery that they were furloughing staff so that they profited from providing less care. Needless to say, we moved the nursery to a better one that provided a better service. In general, we've been happy with the new nursery. However, the COVID idiocy is getting worse. Even in the summer, parents have to wear masks when they drop their children off outside. I'm pretty much the only parent not to do this. This is clearly stupid and not good for my son to see me masked. Last week, with less than a day's notice, we were asked to do a lateral flow test on children, all under 5s. It was worded as a request, but a drop-off, and it was insisted upon. And if you didn't have evidence, toddlers and babies were swabbed at the door. To repeat, these people claim to love children, but they hate them. Boris Johnson acknowledges public rage as he apologizes for attending a number 10 party, saying he believed it was a work event. Oh, I don't know. Why doesn't he just tell the truth? We had a bunch of people outside, in the garden of number 10 at Downing Street, and people brought some booze, and we relaxed for a couple of hours. No one is allowed to have any fun anymore. Fact-checking the BBC's fact check of the doctor who challenged the health secretary on vaccine mandate. Yes, you will recall the doctor, Steve Jones, who challenged Chrome Dome Health Secretary Sajid Javid on the science behind the impending vaccination. Yes. Oh, we are the fact checkers, and we will tell you what the facts are. If you disagree with our facts, you are not a citizen, and you deserve to be crapped on, or some such. And, oh, yes, leaving COVID. I'm sure many of you are breathing a sigh of relief. This is from CBC News. Mischief charge laid in Komagatu Maru Memorial defacing. A man who allegedly defaced Vancouver's Komagatu Maru Memorial in Cole Harbour has been charged with 1 count of mischief. Vancouver police say the BC Prosecution Service approved the charge against 39-year-old Uniar Kurniawan on Monday, and now there is a province-wide warrant for his arrest. In August 2021, the memorial was vandalized with white paint and white handprints. This crime reverberated throughout the community because of what this memorial reveals about our past and the steps we have taken to become a more inclusive community, said Vancouver Police Department spokesperson Sergeant Steve Addison. The Komagatu Maru steamship was held at anchor in Cole Harbor for 2 months after arriving in Vancouver in 1914. Nearly all of the 376 of the mostly Sikh passengers who were seeking asylum were denied entry to Canada in what the Canadian government has acknowledged was a racist act. The ship was ultimately forced to return to India, where it was met by British soldiers. 20 passengers were killed when a riot ensued and others were jailed. The memorial, which includes the names of the passengers, was installed in 2012. Yes, there were people like James Dunsmuir, big businessman in BC, who were keen to pay people as little as possible, make them peons. And the best way to do this was to import many, many people from the Orient. And that's what they tried to do. And Mackenzie King, who later became prime minister for many years, put a stop to this. Put a stop to it. But now we must grovel. Oh, yes, the whole of the Punjab has the right to come to Canada. Canada would be a much better place if, everyone was Sikh. This is all just nonsense. But what I found amusing about this story is that one is supposed to think that, evil white people trashing a memorial. Junior Kurniawan, that is an Indonesian name. It is not a white name. I don't know what the Indonesians have against Sikhs. Perhaps some of you could inform me. And let's go to the chat. You get much more respect in grimy pool hall carrying a straight razor, says Don Willis. Yikes. We got one of those Soros DAs in New York City. He's really giving his masters money worth, says Chokokin 666. As a truth seeker, I don't know how much more truth I can handle, says Dionysius. Sergio Mendes did nothing wrong, says Don Willis. I replied, I mentioned this on Twitter some years ago, that many of the things when I was a boy, much of the music that I loved, I was condemned by hipsters for loving it. And one of them was Sergio Mendes, and there was Glenn Campbell and Burt Bacharach. But it's funny how these people are all hip now. Well, I loved Sergio Mendes before it was hip to do so. Josh Randall Disavow says, I'm utterly numb and ready for the end, LON. Dawn listening to the Bossa Nova says, Quachilango. I'm Bossa Nova. It sounds so exotic. I remember it was a letdown for me when I found out what Bossa Nova means in Portuguese. It just means new thing. Red Sulphur Cafe says, Dad used to take me to an old Cuban barber back when Ovidio was his name. Ovidio was his name. Oh, hello to Schizo Rick, a.k.a. Quantrill Bishop. ABA, he says. I love the smell of my barber shop and the saddle shop, said Sam B. Fauci should be baking cookies in a tree, says Palcasso 88. Someday I'd like to see who these fact checkers are. I'm sure they're not impressive. Well, of course, there is Daniel Dale, who's now at CNN, and he was formerly at the Toronto Star. And Daniel Dale is a former Glee cast member. Actually, he wasn't. There was this picture, let's say this twink picture of him that appeared next to his byline for so long. And I thought, this guy looks like a Glee cast member. But I hope that Daniel Dale does not succumb to the well-known curse of Glee. The masks my work gets, says right on the box, does not protect against COVID. This from Brandon Smith. Dionysus says, I don't hate children. I believe you. I believe you. But I don't know. What was it Evil and Wah said about his school days for university, that the masters, some of them liked children too little and some of them liked them too much. Wolf Barney says the evidence piles up, yet the people in charge double and triple down. David the Gnome says, I knew a guy in college who ordered dried poppies and made tea with them and was a fiend for it. Criterion Amarcord was on sale, says Red Sulphur Cafe. David the Gnome says, poppy tea is dope. Italian Mood Today, waiting to get Fellini DVD in mail, again from Red Sulphur Cafe. It does sound like dope. What's the episode of Seinfeld where Elaine didn't get to go to Tunisia because she was eating bakery stuff with poppy seeds in them? Why Tunisia? Because Mr. Peterman loved that English Patient movie so much. And it's funny, I may have told this story before. I was keen on this woman, and we spent a lot of time talking, and then, she told me that her favorite movie was The English Patient. And so now I don't know how many times she'd seen it before, but she said, we should go see The English Patient together. And I understood immediately this was the test, right? So, she's off in her own world, glorying in this rubbish. And I was just writhing in agony, just like Elaine, writhing in agony. Hurry up and die. And then afterwards, so what did you think? Yeah, it's very well produced. I mean, a very impressive production. I mean, what can I say? Top notch, high quality all the way around. That may be the most embarrassing thing that I have ever done. Okay. Speaking of Eyes Wide Shut, isn't that the only Kubrick movie Kevin doesn't love, says Anne Run? Well, I like Eyes Wide Shut just fine. I'm just not happy with the ending. And many, many people, including the inventor of the Steadicam, who worked with Kubrick, what was his name? A remarkable man, this fellow, Garrett Brown, all the things that he's invented. Garrett Brown does not believe that Stanley Kubrick was responsible for the final edit of the film. He said, they just grabbed the latest Avid, and decided that was the film. We know that Kubrick tinkered with his films, even after they'd been released in the theaters. And there's no doubt in my mind that Kubrick would have understood that ending was weak, and he would have found a better one. Popcasso 88 says, English Patient was on Hollywood's sweet 90s channel. Crap, I changed the channel to 80s and watched The Bounty instead. The Bounty is outstanding movie, except there is a deliberate historical stylism inserted into it that we're supposed to believe that one of the approximate causes for the mutiny was that Lieutenant Bligh had decided they were going to try the horn again. No, that was never his plan, and it would have made no sense to do so. But I mean, that's one of the great mysteries of the mutiny is why. My own view, which I guess is supported by, I read a lot about The Bounty. Carolyn Alexander's book is that Bligh made the mistake of letting his sailors go native. And so there they are living in paradise, with their pick of beautiful dusky women for several months. Time to go home, boys. Time to get back to the squalor and deprivation of the sea. I think that's why. That's why it happened. Juliette Binoche, a lovely woman. Lovely, lovely woman, no question. Elaine wanted to see Sack Lunch instead of The English Patient. It didn't hit me at first just how, starring Dabney Coleman, just how funny and weird that is. Sack Lunch? What would a sack lunch even mean? I mentioned this briefly yesterday. Pedophilia is misunderstood, USA Today claims, then deletes tweets. This is from RT. One of the America's largest newspapers has deleted a social media discussion of pedophilia after stirring outrage by claiming growing scientific consensus that sexual attraction to children is, quote, determined in the womb, unquote. USA Today posted a Twitter message on Tuesday to promote an article on pedophiles titled "What the Public Keeps Getting Wrong About Pedophilia." The newspaper said in a series of posts that pedophiles are likely born with a predisposition to be attracted to children and don't have control over their sexual desires. You see how this is mimicking the gay homosexual acceptance movement? They were born this way. It's innate and immutable. No behavior is innate or immutable. Not a single one, except, I don't know, eating, breathing, eliminating waste, apart from that, all chosen. It's all chosen. Oh, stop picking on the pedophiles. And again, homosexuality was legalized. Oh, stop being mean to these people. Who are they hurting? It must be a lonely life, etc., but that's the one they've chosen. Of course, later we were instructed again that it's innate and immutable. And again, we got the concept of gay, which does not mean the same thing as homosexual. Homosexuality is an act. Gay is a definition. It's a revolutionary definition that, once again, innate, immutable, and by far, first and foremost, the most important thing about them. You hear people say, oh, with regard to Christianity, oh, well, we need to accept gay people. No, it's impossible for Christianity to accept gayness, because gayness is a revolutionary sexual notion that puts, sexual desire and practice ahead of God, even. And we have stories on this from Summit News as well. And, oh yes, USA Today Live said a previous thread did not include all information in the story it was written about is behind a paywall. We made the decision to delete the thread. Not all pedophiles abuse kids, according to this article. Oh, there's a misunderstanding about what a pedophile is. How long before, the alphabet people, LGBT, and there's a whole bunch of stuff added after that, but the P is added to it because, love is love. As I mentioned yesterday, love is love and mentioned many times, it's a universal injunction, and they are softening you up for the acceptance of all paraphilias. According to Paul Bois at Breitbart, written by Alia Dastagir, the article laments that pedophilia stands among the most misunderstood of sexual orientations, with people often making it synonymous with child abuse. When most of the public thinks of pedophilia, they assume it's synonymous with child sexual abuse, a pervasive social problem that has exploded to crisis levels online. Researchers who study pedophilia say the term describes an attraction, not an action, and using it interchangeably with abuse fuels misperceptions. Some scientists have even put forward the idea that pedophilia may originate in the womb, meaning pedophiles have no control over their attraction. The evidence suggests that it is inborn, it's neurological, said clinical psychologist James Cantor. Pedophilia is the attraction to children, regardless of whether the person ever harms. Look, these people need to be shamed. These people like James Cantor and Michael Cito, forensic research director at the Royal Ottawa Healthcare Group in Canada, these people, all people like this, need to be shamed and driven out of society. Because unless there is a ferocious battle against this, they're going to win. They're going to win. Yes, more evidence of a worm's eye view of the world. Yes, sexual desire is apparently the only important thing. This is from GreekReporter.com. A video of lurid sex scenes shot at the Acropolis in the midst of visitors has caused furor in Greece, with authorities investigating the incident. The Ministry of Culture has launched an investigation following the online release of a short film showing two men having sex at the ancient Acropolis in Athens. The 36-minute film, titled Ze Parthenon, a wordplay using Parthenon meaning deflowering in Greek, was first shown at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in mid-December, but came to the attention of the authorities in early January. These people are depraved. That's the only way to describe it. And there is nothing cute about this. It's a worm's eye view of the world. Eric Gill was an English Catholic artist. He was a writer, and he was an illustrator. He was also a sculptor. Sculpture, particularly beautiful, and adorns BBC's broadcasting house in London. Sometime after his death, it was revealed that he was a monstrous sexual pervert who had sex with men, animals, and his own daughters. So this is from the Mail, Katie Fian. Man scales BBC broadcasting house and spends 4 hours destroying sculpture by pedophile artist Eric Gill as police stand by doing next to nothing days after BLM activists were cleared for toppling the Colston statue in Bristol. What exactly are English police paid for now? To visit people and threaten them for saying on a tweet that, trans rights are boring? This just happened, by the way. To show up at a woman's house, threatening her after she had observed a Muslim religious ceremony in Crown lands, and she pointed out to the police that this is illegal. No religious ceremonies are allowed on Crown lands. And so the police decided to show up at her house and threaten her. Not fit for purpose. If the BBC decides to, take down these Eric Gill sculptures, that's one thing. But apparently now it's just a mob shows up or someone shows up and smashes something. But now, of course, if you're going to deface with paint a Kamagatu Maru memorial, that's terrible. Terrible. This is from Tish Still at Unheard. The truth about trans murders. Performative headlines can't disguise the facts. Over the past 2 years, as the entire world became paralyzed by a deadly new pandemic, an altogether different epidemic was silently ripping through one of the West's most marginalized communities. Last year, we're told, was the deadliest year for transgender people since records began. With the situation so grave, is it any surprise that last November, on the Transgender Day of Remembrance, a long list of public and private organizations in the UK lined up to pay homage to trans murder victims? As the mother of a son who identifies as part of the transgender community, the prospect of there being an epidemic of trans murders holds an added weight. Is my son's life in danger? Should I be beside myself with worry when he travels to work, let alone when he goes out to a gig at the weekend? Suffice to say that this is not an issue I can afford to take lightly. Facts always matter, but they take on a particular importance when they're being used to claim that your child could be murdered. So I decided to delve into the research used to inform these claims. The government doesn't publish data on the number of transgender people in the UK, although in 2018 it tentatively estimated that the figure stood between approximately 200 to 500,000. What proportion of that number must have been killed to warrant today's warnings of trans murder epidemic? 10, 100, 1,000? To find out, I analyzed data collected by the trans-led organization Transgender Europe, which has received more than $1 million from the Arcus Foundation, which is based in the US and takes a keen interest in transgender issues, as well as donating almost $150,000 to Stonewall. In 2015, the Arcus Foundation handed $312,000 to Transgender Europe, specifically to supply reliable global data on transgender murders. The website it created provides an interactive map and links to documents naming the transgender victims. Looking at Transgender Europe's list of cases, it became clear, to my relief, that the total number of murders reported for the United Kingdom since 2008 amounted to 11. This translates as a murder rate of around 0.165%. Now, that is still significantly higher than the murder rate for the UK as a whole. The Office of National Statistics reports that the homicide rate in the UK for the year ending March 2020 was 11.7 per million people, rising to 17 per million among men. But take a closer look at the list of trans murder victims, and that figure of 11 becomes increasingly suspect. For instance, two of the listed victims, Vicky Thompson and Jacqueline Cowdery, appear to have been erroneously included. Thompson died by suicide while incarcerated in Her Majesty's Prison Leeds, while Cowdery's death was ultimately ruled as non-suspicious. This reduces the total to 9 unlawful deaths, all of whom were born male. By contrast, the number of homicides committed by transgender people between 2008 and 2017 was 12. So they're killing more people than are being killed. For context, the number of women killed by men during the same period was 1,800. So much for our alleged cis privilege. Yeah. So there's another thing that we have been lied to about. Oh, that they're just being, struck down indiscriminately in the streets and the bodies are piling up like cordwood. It is not true. This is a weird, strange story. This is from Twitchy, Sarah D. It somehow flew under the radar yesterday, but today a lot of people are getting a good look at how low some outlets are willing to sink in order to stick it to Republicans, thanks to the lovely folks at Alphabet People Nation. She's 13 has been trending on Twitter today, and rightly so, because evidently there are people out there who need to be reminded that kids are off limits. Alphabet People Nation's big scoop on Carolyn Cruz required wading into the comments section on a TikTok video, which is pretty creepy and gross thing to do when a 13-year-old girl is involved. To wit, Ted Cruz's teen daughter comes out as bisexual. Andrew Follett commented, the publication just outed a 13-year-old girl who said she hadn't told other people. This publication is evil. Hadn't told other people. If you put that on your TikTok, you put that in your listing, yeah, you have told the whole world, actually. Sorab Amari said she's 13, barely out of her tween years. You despicable perverts. It strikes me that age of consent in most American states is 16, and in some it's 18. So when we say that when a 13-year-old girl says that she's bisexual, has she had sex with anyone? Not bloody likely, but again, I don't know the circumstances, but this sort of self-outing strikes me as performative. That's the word that comes to mind. From Chris Tomlinson at Breitbart, another piece about the virtues of diversity. Nearly 9 in 10 suspects involved in fatal shootings in Sweden are either born abroad or from migrant backgrounds, statistics reveal, as the country continues to deal with record levels of fatal shootings. In 2021, Sweden saw another record high number of fatal shootings as the country continues to see fatal gun violence, largely driven by criminal gang activity across the country. According to statistics obtained by the French newspaper La Croix, the average age of suspects in fatal shootings in Sweden is 23 years old, and claims that 85% of the suspects are either born abroad or come from immigration backgrounds. Swedish police claim that there are as many as 2,500 members of gangs in the city of Stockholm alone, and that the dismantling of prior gangs made up of immigrants from the Balkans who came to Sweden in the 1990s has led to the formation of smaller and more violent gangs. Yes, first the Swedes decided they were going to bring in all these people from Montenegro. That didn't work out very well. So then they decided, let's invite the whole Arab world to Sweden. And it's been an absolute disaster. But guess the elite has taken the view now that there's no such thing as being Swedish or that anyone is Swedish. You've heard the argument, and I once entertained it, that the reason for our decline in the last 100 years is that so many of the best and brightest were slaughtered during the First World War. But of course, Sweden did not participate in the First World War or the Second World War. So there must be another explanation or explanations for our decadence. Again, I go back to, boredom, spitefulness, the imp of the perverse. If you read Roland Huntford's The New Totalitarians, which came out around 1970, Sweden is in many respects a deeply unpleasant country where a consensus thinking is ruthlessly enforced. An example from Huntford's book that the Swedish government is rather fascist in its organization. You have the government, you have business, you have the academy, and they all get together and they decide the changes that are going to be made. For instance, in the late 1960s, apparently there are not enough mothers in the workforce. How can we propel mothers into the workforce? Well, through a neologism. In Swedish, there was a word which means approximately the same as the English housewife, but the Swedish government came up with a new word, which roughly translates as the woman who stays at home, i.e., selfish. High level of civilization in Sweden, but I guess, let's just wreck it. Let's wreck it for fun and then congratulate ourselves for doing so. David Baddiel writes in The Guardian, and I can hardly believe that this controversy is still going ahead. Why don't Jews play Jews? Maureen Lipman sparked fury by suggesting the ex-Israeli prime minister should not be played by Helen Mirren. But, says David Baddiel, why shouldn't authentic casting apply to all minorities? And where is the outcry over BoJack Horseman? Indeed, where is the outcry over BoJack Horseman? Soon after the brilliant It's a Sin came out, Russell T. Davies justified his decision to cast only gay actors in gay parts by saying, quote, they are not there to act gay because acting gay is a bunch of codes for a performance. You wouldn't cast someone able-bodied and put them in a wheelchair. You wouldn't? Maybe he should speak to Marlon Brando about that. Authenticity is leading us to joyous places. How about Daniel Day-Lewis? Has this guy seen any movies? It would be wrong to suggest that no one questioned this statement, but it became part of the ongoing conversation about casting and minorities. Davis was not, thankfully, mightily abused on social media for saying it, which is what happened last week to Maureen Lipman after she suggested, on being asked about the casting of Helen Mirren in a biopic of Israel's former Prime Minister Golda Meir, that Jewish parts should perhaps be played by Jewish actors. Oh, this is a polemic expressing my opinion that over a period of extreme intensification of the progressive conversation about representation, inclusion, and microaggression, and what is and isn't offensive to minorities, one minority, Jews, has been routinely neglected. In the book, some time is devoted to the issue of casting. In terms of this conversation, casting is most directly an employment issue, a correction against previous traditions that have meant less work for minority actors, but it is also, and I would say at its core, more so about respect. There is something disrespectful this argument runs about casting an able-bodied actor in a disabled part. How about you see whether they can act? Because typically you want the best, actor that you can in a role. Let's see. The Netflix animation BoJack Horseman is a stone-cold masterpiece, but the show's creator, Raphael Bob Waxberg, has apologized profusely because a Vietnamese-American character in it, Diane Nguyen, is voiced by the not Vietnamese at all, Alison Brie. Shame. Shame, 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 shame. In BoJack Horseman, there is another character called Lenny Turtletop. He's a turtle, but a very Jewish one. A very Jewish Hollywood producer stereotype, and he's played by J.K. Simmons, who is not Jewish. There's been no outcry over that, and Waxberg has seen no need to get anguished about it. This is true across the board. Jewish is the minority that you can cast with actors not of that minority, and hardly until very recently to hear a whisper of concern. Again, has this guy ever seen any movies? For decades and decades and decades, mobsters, Italian mobsters, were routinely played by Jews. Robert Evans said one of the reasons he was so enthusiastic about The Godfather, his production of it, was that Italians were going to be played by Italians. Now, of course, James Caan and Abe Vigoda are in that film. Indians, a feather, not dot. For years and years and years and years in Hollywood, they were played, well, by dark-skinned ethnics like Italians. Oh dear, now we get on to the Warsaw Ghetto. And so as far as this controversy goes, Badil says, primarily it's about Jews being assumed anti-Semitically to be successful and privileged and powerful, and therefore not in need of the protections that identity politics affords other minorities. In the case of casting, that falls down as well. Jews are everywhere in showbiz, so Jewish actors don't need that leg up. Oh, okay. I'm perfectly happy, and I'm sure others would be as well, that all Jewish roles be played by Jewish actors. But turnabout is fair play. Is it fair that non-Jewish people are played by Jewish people? Is it? I think that, we can make this deal. Fine. All homosexual roles have to be played by homosexuals. All Jewish roles have to be played by Jews. Of course, I'm not quite sure that Jewish actors would be happy to being relegated to 1 to 2% of all acting roles. I mean, this is an idiotic argument. And Badil should be ashamed of himself. That, when I see Jason Isaacs play a hard-ass Ranger captain in Black Hawk Down, did I say, he's an English Jew. Why is he playing this role? I don't care. The fact is that Isaacs is outstanding in this movie. I mentioned before that he's outstanding in the Australian version of Peter Pan, where he plays Captain Hook and Mr. Darling. Those are not Jewish roles, but who gives a toss? Honestly, it's all so tiresome. Let's look at the chat. Okay. Being a Schopenhauerian is the only authentic Christianity, says Dionysus. Ask Barbara Lerner Spector about Sweden, says Joel Gerke. He and his entire court spoke French. Oh, are we talking about Peter the Great, the so-called great? Yep. I'm going to build my capital in a swamp. And many, many, many people will die. Oh, yes, and I'm going to nationalize the Orthodox Church. He was a monstrous figure. He really was. Yeah, shameless westernizer said, Red Sulphur Cafe. You may have heard the story that this emperor, this Tsar, that he traveled Europe incognito, right? That's not possible. That's not possible at all. For a start, he was 7 feet tall at a time when what the average height of men would have been about, 5'5", 5'4", and so incognito, eh? He traveled using the name Peter Romanov. Boy, that's an impenetrable disguise, isn't it? Let's talk about the supply chain. This is from Paul Bois at Breitbart. He probably pronounces it Boys, actually. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg was hailed as the man who saved Christmas Tuesday over his handling of the supply chain crisis, as Americans around the country shared photos of empty grocery shelves on social media. And Mark Krikorian, the immigration reformer, published a whole bunch of them. Orange juice section, I'd say about 95% empty. Dairy section, close to 100% empty. Meat section is what we can see here, about 70% empty. Jordan Chamberlain, the shelves at Target near my apartment. This is wild. Yeah. See, but the argument from authority. Oh, don't believe any of this stuff about empty shelves, but I've seen empty shelves. No, you haven't. No, you haven't. And in any event, even if there are empty shelves, it's not Biden's fault or Pete Buttigieg's fault. It's COVID-19 and Trump. Trump's responsible for COVID-19. Don't believe your lying eyes. From the same source, this time from John Carney, the Netflix film Don't Look Up is about a group of experts who detect a looming disaster but cannot summon an adequate public response because of the fecklessness of a populist president. Boo! And the greed of our corporate allies. If we were to change the movie to reflect our current inflation crisis, it would be the experts who told us not to pay any attention to the looming disaster, which is slightly more frightening in my view. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported Wednesday that consumer prices rose 7% in 2021, the biggest annual gain since 1982. Food prices are up 6.5%, household furniture up 7.4%, appliances up 6%, tools and hardware up 7.2%, clothing up 5.8%, and cars are up 12%. Everywhere you look, prices are up. The time has passed when inflation could be written off as transitory or artificially elevated by shortages in a few items. Inflation is everywhere and has staying power. So why didn't the Federal Reserve see this coming? A year ago, the Federal Reserve was forecasting that inflation in 2021 would run at 1.8%. This may be the biggest forecasting error in Fed history. Now, the Fed doesn't forecast the consumer price index, which is what the BLS reported on Wednesday. It prefers to use the personal consumption price index produced by the Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis. There are a bunch of technical differences between the two indices that you can read about here. In general, they tend to move in the same direction. Historically, PCE inflation has run about half a point below CPI inflation, although in November, that gap had widened out to 1.1 percentage points, with CPI at 6.8 and PCE at 5.7%. Perhaps even more frustrating is the Fed never really caught up in reality. In March, it raised its projection for 2021 to 2.4%, and in June to 3.4%, and in September to 4.2%. By the final meeting of the year, they were projecting 5.2%. Yeah, our prediction's wrong, and we can see where this is going and going and going. No, but you see, if you look at our last prediction, it wasn't that far off. The fact is that economists are rubbish at economic predictions, and they always have been. And yet we are enslaved by them. You know, Lord Keynes, who was one of the most famous of all economists, once wrote that it would be good for his profession if economists were not regarded as oracles, but as perhaps as competent as dentists. Well, all this money has been created. So what's going to be done about it? The money that's borrowed is never going to be paid back. And of course, there's two ways that this can be dealt with. One, by a default, or two, by inflation. And it would appear that the United States has decided inflation. That's what it's going to be. Hey, don't complain about your money being worthless. It's nothing to do with us. It's COVID or factors beyond our control. This is from Kane at Citizen Free Press. Rick Santelli, who is at CNBC, has the numbers. Gasoline up 56%, heating oil up 42%, used cars up 37.3%. Yes, I just recently was acquainted with the now shocking price of used cars in the United States. Car rentals up 36%, natural gas up 31%, hotels up 27.6%, beef up 18.6%, pork 15.1%, furniture 13.8%. Jen Psaki has admitted that the inflation number is going to be ugly. And I'm looking at a picture of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris going down the steps in Air Force One, and they're wearing masks because, of course, they are. And here's a sad story. but it is really illustrative of the way we live now. Refusal to understand nature, our insistence upon ignoring biology, ignoring facts that, well, actually everyone knows. This is from Sarah Kennedy Ellis, who, according to her Twitter, is a vice president at Google, ex Adobe, ex Marketo, proud Baylor Bear. Yeah, you're a populist. You like football. Data nerd. Never trust any woman who calls herself a nerd. Never. Oh, and she's also a trap music aficionado. I don't know that I believe any of this except for the qualifications. She writes, after 3.5 years and counting 9 cycles of in vitro fertilization, 2 miscarriages in the last 6 months, I think it's time for me to finally say it out loud publicly. Infertility is a special kind of fresh hell that takes a toll on even the strongest, most resilient people I've met in life. I always used to think and know with conviction I wouldn't have traded anything in my career along the way or marriage of 12 years and counting because this was always the timing we wanted, needed, and pursued together. Maybe too late, still feels so early, but life has its own plan. I often think back to the day I accepted the job at Marketo. It was the single biggest blessing I could have ever imagined, and I wouldn't trade it. But you were always trading something. I just always assumed my work ethic, stubbornness, willingness to persist would conquer all. But thousands of women know, just like I've learned, that may not be true. In the last 3 years, I felt like the least special version of myself as a marketer. I gave 110% of all I had to my career, but that choice is now not possible with 10 hours a week managing fertility 3 years running. But the one thing I've learned most is how important it is to share your journey, to be part of a community women battling the same. I built my career being transparent and a leader, and I have with my team, but I've been weirdly shy to share this new part of who I am here. Perhaps that is, Sarah Kennedy Ellis, because the state of your ovaries is none of our business. Why are you telling us this? She's clearly telling us this because she wants to be applauded for it. She is another hero of suffering. She continues, couldn't tell you why, but I'm done with that because it's exhausting. I cry more now in a given quarter than I ever did in my first 37 years of life. I can thank the 850 plus hormone shots I've taken for that, but I blamed myself instead by hiding my new reality. All of that to say, it's just a reminder for the other women and spouses who support them also going through it. You aren't alone. It sucks. And my DMs are always open. All I can do is my small part to continue to push more open dialogue for those struggling quietly for too long. Well, when a woman reaches the age of about 37 years old, 80% of her eggs are defective. That precise number might not be known to all women, but all women know that the older that they are, before they decide, that they want a child, the less chance there is of actually coming up with a child, or not coming up with a child that is in some way defective. This woman had a good, 15 years to get pregnant before she decided at the age of 37 that, oh, now it's time. The stars are aligned. Fertility is not a spigot that can be opened and closed. But this is, we seem to have brainwashed people, men as well as women, into believing this nonsense that, oh no, you got to wait, you got to get that corner office before you have a child. Oh no, we couldn't really afford it. Really? I've heard people making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year claim that they can't afford a child. There's other considerations as well. When one lives a life of selfishness, which is what we're talking about in this case, the older one is, the less likely one is to agree with disruptions in one's patterns. I have always done, pretty much exactly what I wanted to do, but now I can't. And this leads to a great deal of unpleasantness. A great deal of unpleasantness. It's not just the defective eggs, the problem of defective eggs. It's the older that women get, the fewer eggs they produce. And it begins dropping off rapidly in the in their 30s. But I have seen this. Let's see. This is from a site called babymed.com. While a 21-year-old woman might grow 30 to 40 eggs in one round, by age 40, that number drops to 6 or 8 eggs. The older you get, the harder it becomes to produce eggs. But I just cannot regard IVF as anything other than barbarism or, Frankensteinian medicine. That no, she could have made babies the old-fashioned way, and I'm assured that it's a pleasurable experience. But no, you need 850 plus hormone injections. There was a columnist with the Globe and Mail who wrote a column. This was like 20 years ago or so, maybe more. And she wanted all the sympathy because I believe she was like something like 49 years old and decided now's the time to have a child. Oh, so for like 30 years, this woman had, or more, this woman had regulated her reproductive health, as we're supposed to call it now, using birth control or abortion. All of the things being equal, the act of sexual intercourse has a 1 in 4 chance, or risk, if you like, of ending up in pregnancy. There are people who suffer from infertility not associated with aging, but for most people, if you have sexual intercourse, on a regular basis, a child will result. But again, this woman, she admits that she is personally responsible for this situation, but she still wants our sympathy. Well, actually, she wants more than that. She wants our adulation of her because of her bravery in going public with this. Is there anything that people don't go public with these days? Malmesbury man, who has been translating Eric Zemmour's speeches, commented on Sarah Kennedy Ellis, "This is bleak, but a person's political beliefs are strongly correlated with their parents' beliefs, especially in higher socioeconomic status families. The net result of these kinds of stories will be fewer future liberals. They are failing to replace themselves." He continues, in the US, historically, Catholic and evangelical whites have had well above replacement fertility rates. It will be interesting to see how much the crash of the birth rate post 2020 happened among seculars versus Christians. And Curiosités Classiques says, yes, but they plan to convert your children in the cathedral. Yes, this is exactly true. Apparently, a great many seculars have sworn off children entirely because of the climate or some such thing. Now, if the rest of the world isn't taking that stance, well, it would be, wicked to bring children into the world at this time. Oh, because the world has always been a peaceful place where everyone has abundant resources, where there is no poverty, misery, murder, war, etc., etc. It's only now that the world has become a horrible, horrible place. Yes, women posting their L's online. Some black woman said, if men are agreeing with you, you said something stupid. Okay. Good luck finding that husband. I mean, I know that's heteronormative of me. Let's look at the chat. Media Head says Music Monday. Yeah, you're going to get that tomorrow, along with Theater Thursday. I'm sorry about that, but I'm looking for a place, and this is occupying a fair amount of time. And tortured by some. Okay, I don't know what that. Oh, yes, before being savagely executed in Ekaterinburg, that would be the Romanovs. Wolf Barney says, I used to believe that when my wife and I decided to have kids, it would happen. Nobody told me that it can be difficult. Turned out fine, but it took a while. Well, I'm glad to hear that. But there have been so many movies and television shows. This was even on King of the Hill, you know? And what is he? Peaches. He's told Hank his wife wants another child. And I don't know, Bobby is put out by this, but I'm not good enough for you. And of course, Hank's wife is around 40 or so. And it turns out that Hank has a low sperm count. And you got to eat peaches and ice cube baths, this sort of thing. And to Hank's credit, he just says no. Okay, that's it. I'm not humiliating myself any further. We have one child, and we love our one child, and that will just have to do. Sex doesn't lead to pregnancy. That's a conspiracy theory, says Seraphim Goose. You often hear these stories about so-called unwanted pregnancies amongst women who consider themselves to be intelligent, and I suppose technically, based on IQ and academic accomplishment, they are intelligent. Oh yes, it was an accident. Oh, you're on the birth control pill, are you? Oh yeah. Well, it's 100% effective. 100% effective. So you just stopped taking them for some reason, or forgot to take them, and it struck me years ago that such is the power of the contraceptive lobby, that people have come to a conclusion. This is a metaphor, of course, that birth control is in the air, because furious women. How did I get pregnant? Come on, you don't know how sex works? Really? Is that what you're telling me? Or what the Muriel Sparks novel, The Only Problem, where a woman, ex-girlfriend of this man, shows up. They've broken up, and he shows up some months later and says, I'm pregnant. And the man, quite peeved, says, how did that happen? And the woman responds, in the usual manner, I expect. Larry Elder left an impression on me about waiting to start a family, says Urban Planner. I must have injured my brain, or at least the part where you remember all these damn lyrics, says Quachilango. Misery loves company, forsooth, says Red Sulphur Cafe. Yes, indeed. Indeed, it does. Okay. Anyone else? I'll protect you from Hooded Claw. Keep the vampires from your door. Frankie Goes to Hollywood, says Dawn Willis. On King of the Hill, did Dale ever find out if John Redcorn knocked up his wife? That's Media Hits. I believe that he never did, although Joseph seemed to have understood. And that I believe at one point Dale came to the conclusion that his son was not actually his son, but it wasn't some other man that had impregnated his wife Nancy. It was aliens. That's one of the funniest things on the show. John Redcorn, an admirable man in many ways, but the deplorable sexual morality, that he was really determined to pass on his Native American Indian heritage to his son, who had no interest in it at all. Zero. He thought it was just stupid. So John Redcord decides to take his son on a, what do they call it? A spirit quest? Is that what they call it? So they're out there in the woods, and Joseph, his son, putative son, is just bored out of his mind. And then he decides to break stuff. He just starts smashing up their camp. And John Redcorn is horrified. The joke is the Dale who goes along. He's the one who has the vision quest, right? And he says, I see the Indian. I am the Indian. Now I understand why I've always loved tobacco so much and hated the federal government so much. Oh, yes. In that episode, John Redcord finds out that, yes, his Indian tribe were cannibals. And he says something like, no, we stopped doing that like 700 years ago. This was after Hank's son, Bobby, had decided to celebrate, in school, part of a, show and tell, to celebrate the great American Indian cannibal. Yeah. As mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Donald Fagen tomorrow, and I will also be talking about Jean Cocteau's La Belle et la Bête. I had scheduled Basil Dearden's 1969 film, The Assassination Bureau, for January 27th. I'm going to be swapping that out for something else. I had seen the movie when it came out in 1969, which was 52 years ago, or 53 years ago now, and I just had warm memories of it. Maybe just because Diana Rigg was in it, because she's just so gorgeous and such a great actress and so charming. And I rewatched it last night, and it's pretty dire. And it is so arch. It is so very arch. You had a lot of movies like that in the 60s. The Great Race, all of these, racing around the world in cars or balloons or whatever. It's a mad world, and all this old-timey stuff. Ooh, let's make a movie about the old-timey days because they were so zany. It's not so much that it's over the top, is that it's rather cringe-inducing. Anyway, so I'll find something else to replace that. On the book club on Friday, I'm going to be talking about Joseph McBride's biography of the great Billy Wilder. So one of these days, Alice, one of these days. Yeah. Do you remember when that came up on Futurama? Man has always longed for the moon. And then they show a clip from the honeymooners, one of these days, Alice, bang, zoom to the moon. And Leela says, I had no idea your astronauts were so fat. And Fry says, he wasn't an astronaut, he was an actor, and he was using space travel as a metaphor for beating his wife. I just love in Futurama how Fry goes from being densely stupid to being surprisingly insightful. All those Tony Curtis movies, says Emmett Kelly's Earth. Yeah, pretty zany. Pretty zany. Is Ingraham Botoxing or what, says Buddy. I don't watch the show, so I can't say. Steely Dan is your favorite band? Favorite band, says Don Willis. They're one of my favorite bands. No question about it. Steely Dan is a great musicians band, says Quacho Lango. Bob Stanley in his book, Yeah, suggests that Steely Dan would have had more success on the charts if their singles, like Bodhisattva, had less recondite names. And I think he makes a good point. Do you want to buy a single called Bodhisattva? It sounds weird and foreign and quite possibly dangerous, whereas Peg, well, come on, everyone understands that, right? Actress on Murdoch Mysteries expecting her first child at 43, says Palcasso 88. That is one, that's a hypothesis, if one could call it that has been suggested for the rise in the tremendous rise in autism in children is brain damage due to women giving birth, particularly for the first time at such an advanced age. I don't know whether there's any truth to it. Wolf Barney says, when I was in 4th grade, it didn't get better than the Great Race. But he says, should single women be allowed to adopt? I would say no. I would say no. Anyway, that's it for today. I will be back tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to make a donation to this live stream, and many thanks to those who have done so, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. And if you're in Canada, donations may be made to the live stream directly via Interact at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.